Welcome to this third installment of Encouragement in a Pandemic. You'll notice that I changed the name from Encouragement Within an Epidemic to Encouragement in a Pandemic. We are in a pandemic, not an epidemic. Pandemic affects everybody. The disease affects everybody. But I like the acronym, EWE, because it's all about you. But anyway, it's still all about you. We just changed the name. So this week I interviewed Jeff Bradford, and Jeff is the pastor at Christ the King Presbyterian, downtown Raleigh. If you live downtown Raleigh, please consider Christ the King Presbyterian. It is an awesome church. We worshiped there for about a year, and I don't know a lot of churches out there who would actually send people away to join our church plant. And so that's exactly what they did. Families joined us from Christ the King when we first started here south of Raleigh, and so just really love the vision of Christ the King, have been so blessed by their ministry, and just so excited to have interviewed him and for you to hear this discussion. Jeff talks about what the season is like and compares our time right now to Israel's time in the desert. And so it's a fascinating concept, especially the way he unpacks it as only Jeff can. And so enjoy this interview. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, good to see you, Mark.
You too, brother. This is Jeff Bradford. He is a dear friend of mine, and I'm excited to be able to interview him today and ask him some questions about desert life. And but before we get to that, I wanted to give Jeff an opportunity to just introduce himself a little bit, his family, where he works, who is he, and that kind of thing. So go ahead, Jeff.
Sure. My name is Jeff Bradford. I'm pastor of Christ the King Presbyterian Church in downtown Raleigh, and me and my family live in the Cameron Village area of Raleigh. We have 6 boys, Susan and I do, and 3 at college, 3 at home. That keeps us really busy. Susan's also in grad school, and so our lives are very full of managing online everything right now. But yeah, and the other thing you should know about me, I'm from East Tennessee originally, planted a church went to seminary and then planted a church in downtown Philadelphia and was there in that area for about 16 years before God brought us here in 2011. I love what I do as being a pastor. I love being in God's Word and being with His people, and particularly looking at the church as an entity that's really about mission, about reaching a city, and about mobilizing the lives of people to be a part of God's kingdom and understand their calling in that. That also makes me a huge Mark fan and Res Life fan. I love what is happening in your church, Mark. And you're one of the reasons that I get up out of bed in the morning. I just love seeing the God at work through the very simple means of the local church. And so I'm the president of the Mark fan club as well. So that's my other.
Well, that's great, because there's another club called I'm the president of the Jeff Club, of the Jeff fan club too. So there we go. The feeling's mutual, brother. Well, thanks for that. I appreciate it. This is a video that focuses on encouragement within the pandemic. So thank you for those words of encouragement.
Good.
So let's get to it. In terms of understanding desert life. So when I first asked you about me interviewing you, you had talked about how this pandemic can be similar to what Israel experienced in the desert. And I wanted to just give you an opportunity to expound on that a little bit. Describe, what do you mean by that?
Sure. I think it's fascinating to look back in Scripture at the history of how God has used the wilderness or the desert in the life of His people. And this is a constant theme in Scripture, but it's also one in the early church. And I think it's one that, because we're Americans and we live in subtropical North Carolina or in the temperate America, we don't really have a whole lot of affinity with or familiarity with life in the desert. God, after bringing His people out of Egypt, where they'd been in bondage for 400 years, He takes them through the Red Sea, and the whole premise is we're going to the promised land. And yet God takes his time. And some of that's in response to the sins of the people, but some of that is God's very purposeful direction and leadership of his people straight into the wilderness, straight into this desert. And I've heard other commentators and pastors talk about how God's purpose in that was, he had to first get them out of Egypt, but then he had to get Egypt out of them. And that 40 years in the desert, God was teaching them to depend on him, teaching his people to rely on him, and putting them in a place where all the landscape looks the same, where resources are scarce, where you have to rely on God every day. You remember God sent manna from heaven, which just the word means what is it? They didn't even know what they were eating, and so that they would learn to live on what God says and learn to follow him and trust in him. In the desert, you have to learn to be, and this is God's purpose, I think, in Israel's time in the desert, was teaching them to be people who are people of the ear and not of the eye. Now, what I mean by that is that God gave them the law, his law at Mount Sinai in the desert. He reveals his character. God, in a sense, marries his people in the desert, and their honeymoon is built a tent in the desert. It's their honeymoon suite, and he has this life with them where he's teaching them to live by what they hear from him and not what they see around them. Because everything they see around them says, we're going to die here. Everything they see around them says, we are not going to make it. This is death. And God says, no, this is life. And it's this remarkable period in Israel's history, and a really sweet period. And I think it's interesting, too, to learn the history of the early church. In the first centuries, there was a movement of a lot of the disciples. I don't mean the disciples of Jesus. I mean the early followers in the early church that became what's known now as the Desert Fathers, who moved out into the desert. Mm-hmm. People like St. Anthony, who moved out in the desert in order to connect with God and to have this time of experiencing what Israel experienced, of learning to be people of the ear and not the eye, people to learn to be repentant quickly, learn to rely on God and rest in him. St. Anthony moved out into a tomb out in the middle of the desert and sort of like embracing this, like, I need to know what this is like. And I think that's really instructive for where we are right now, because this is a time where we're isolated. It's a time where we experience and we're fearful about where is the future going to take us. We're watching our stock market. We're watching our businesses. We're watching the food sources in America. We have lots of questions. And it's a time where a lot of people are experiencing fear. I've talked to a number of folks in our congregation. There's just a lot of mental health issues coming up. Yeah. And so it's a really hard time. And yet, I think this may be, in a weird way, God's gift to the church in teaching us some of the same things, taking us on that same journey into the desert. And the last thing I'll say about that, too, is what's fascinating, if you read, for example, Matthew's gospel, you see Jesus being baptized. This is all after the birth narrative, right? But he's baptized. He begins his earthly ministry, and he's right after his baptism, he's sent out into the wilderness for 40 days. And then after that, he comes out of that and goes up on a mountain and gives the Sermon on the Mount. And it's Jesus walking the paces of Israel. And he's walking the paces. He's going through the water, like with the Red Sea. He's going into the desert. And he quotes Deuteronomy back to the devil. The man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. I am a person who, in my humanity, even as the Son of God, am living by what I see, what I hear, not what I see. And so, like, you see Jesus walking as he is faithful Israel. He's like, I'm the new Israel. And he goes up on the mountain, gives the law. But like, it's such a picture of like Jesus going in the desert. And therefore, it just gives me a lot of hope that Jesus can meet us in the desert. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. And we talked a lot about over the years how God uses things like isolation or suffering as lessons, as things God is teaching us and disciplining us in. Yeah, thanks for unraveling that for us. Modern day modern day church is a follow up question, which I did not prepare you for, but you had mentioned that we could learn a lot from the Chinese Christian church, and I wonder if you just mentioned that, and I wonder how that dovetails into our situation here.
Yeah, I think that it's fascinating to watch what's happened over the last years. I mean, if you look on the big story in church history in the last 30 years, the thing that will be talked about over and over again is the explosion of the gospel in China. And under really hard conditions, under a place of scarcity, and they've had to be tremendously creative over and over again. And you talk about Zoom calls. The Chinese church has been using Zoom calls for forever. They have been super creative in knowing how to gather, encourage, have community in when they don't have all the trappings that we do. They don't have the buildings, they don't have the budgets, they don't have the grand church experience that we do with all the programming and all. And I think that in an interesting way, them walking through that really hard period and God blessing that, it's a really good moment for the American church to turn our eyes back to China. And I know that there's a lot of right now animosity toward China because of this virus, but this is a really good time for American believers to turn our eyes to China and say, man, these people have in their desert developed a tremendous vibrancy in life.
Yeah.
And God has used that for the spread of the gospel. God's used that for the encouragement of believers, for the creativity of churches. I do think that this is the moment for particularly small congregations who emphasize maybe a relationship more over programming, because that's what we can afford to do. That's what you can afford to do. But I think that there's an opportunity here for us to have an abundance mindset rather than a scarcity mindset. Like, God has given us what we need to be able to thrive here. And I think that's true on a very individual level. As we're sheltered at home, we're trying to figure out how to live in a place where we feel isolated. And yet God has given us an opportunity to learn to live by what we hear from Him. But it's also true for the church. So I'm in a weird way, I'm encouraged. I think this is maybe one of the best things that could happen to the American church. And I certainly don't say I'm wishing calamity on people.
No, I understand that. It's just the wrestling that happens in the desert is where so much of the growth and maturity happens, and it's the land of milk and honey, and it's in the land of milk that they wrestled with the Lord, and the Lord taught them so much, and it was in the land of honey where they sat in their lazy boys at times and stopped growing, and that's where God had to keep sending His prophets.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, hey, brother, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your words and wisdom. I think it's excellent, and a lot of good things to chew on here. So, brother, I love you, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for leading us in that. Super encouraging, and really appreciate you as a person. Love you, man, and look forward to actually seeing you face to face sometime. Tune in next week as we're going to be interviewing Jimmy Stopper. Jimmy Stopper organizes a Christian organization called Men of Armor. You can check them out, menofarmor.com. And Jimmy Stopper and Chad Paparaki, the ones that organize and mobilize men in this area to grow as disciples of Jesus Christ. And they do so through a number of really, really cool ways. And so interviewing Jimmy, see what words he has of encouragement he has for us. So please tune in next week once again as we keep doing this, as we attempt to encourage you in a pandemic. God bless.